Tēnā koutou katoa. Ngā mihi nui ki ngā kaitiaki o tēnei whenua. Tēnei te mihi ki a koutou, mō tō manaakitanga, mō tō tautoko o te kaupapa o te rānei e. Ko tainui te waka, ko kapuarangi te maunga, ko wainui te awa, ko tōrere nui arua te tipuna, ko ngaitai te iwi, ko Maia, Jessup, Nuku, ahau. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation and the hospitality. I'm Maia Nuku, and I'm visiting from New York, where I've lived for the past 3 years, working at the Metropolitan Museum of Art as their Oceania curator. Prior to that, I worked in London, where I was born, working on collaborations and research projects with Pacific artists, practitioners, curators and historians in the stores of European ethnographic museums that house collections of Pacific art from the 18th century onwards. In New York, I look after a collection of over 2,000 works of art, ancestral treasures or taonga, heirlooms that have been passed down through the generations that come from islands throughout the Pacific, from the archipelagos that spread, these archipelagos spread across about a third of the globe. So it's a hugely complex landscape that I'm trying to present in 4 galleries. This is an image of the principal Oceania gallery. So the collection actually includes art from Taiwan and the Philippines, Indonesia and island Southeast Asia, and continues that kind of Austronesian narrative to Papua New Guinea, the islands of Guam and Micronesia to the north of the Pacific, and then we travel eastwards to Polynesia, so with Hawaii at the northern extremity, out to Rapa Nui or Easter Island to the east, and then down to Aotearoa, New Zealand, bottom southwest, where Pacific navigators travelled from between 800 to 1200 AD, the last final kind of land masses to be settled in the region. And there they developed a distinctive culture, the Maori culture, and I'm going to focus a bit on an exhibition that happened at the Met, that the Met hosted in 1984. So I wonder, what does it mean to be born in and of the ocean? The seas, this great ocean, might appear to divide up the world into scattered units of land, but at the same time it connects us. It was the Tongan scholar and writer Epeli Hauofa who argued for a revision of the way in which we perceive the region. In his often cited work, Our Sea of Islands, he pointed out that academics from outside had generally represented the Pacific as a region of tiny islands, mutually isolated in a huge ocean, each individual nation too small to escape a cycle of economic dependency. He suggested it was time to adopt a more affirmative understanding of the region, one that emerged from Pacific peoples' own understanding of the relationships that existed between them. These relationships are long-standing, cultural, linguistic, genealogical, born of the sheer cosmopolitanism of the region, from centuries of migration, travel, dynamic trade, and exchange. He wrote, "The term Pacific Islands connotes small areas of land surfaces sitting atop submerged reefs or seamounts. Oceania, on the other hand, connotes a sea of islands with their inhabitants. The world of our ancestors was a large sea full of places to explore, to make homes in, to breed generations of seafarers like themselves. People raised in this environment were at home in the sea. They developed great skills for navigating their waters and the spirit to traverse even the few large gaps that separated their island groups." So the way that I'm thinking about working with the collections is really to try and draw up key themes to help visitors and visiting public, local audiences, returning visitors, and international audiences to really kind of navigate these collections. The challenge is really how to make the Pacific and these collections relevant in an encyclopedic museum that has 21 curatorial departments and what I understand from kind of talking to visitors and having people kind of stand in the galleries and talk to the audience is that people are very taken with monumentality of the installation and the scale of the works. And then I think we lose them a bit because it's very difficult to penetrate. You know, they're very other in their aesthetic. We move from, you know, the adjacent galleries of Greek and Roman into the aesthetic of Pacific art. So I've been trying to work out ways that we could really celebrate the very distinctive aesthetic of the Pacific collections, and to kind of puncture this, the classic idealized canon that you see from the galleries in the Greek and Roman spaces immediately before. And one of the ways I'm thinking to do that is to talk about the transient nature of some of these sculptures and works of art. These things weren't often designed to be used, you know, for long. They weren't designed for longevity. In a sense, they are animated and vivified by people, by song, chant, ritual protocols. And so one of the things I want to think about in this brief paper, you know, just discussion is how we pull people into the frame, how we kind of animate the collections with people. So that's what I'll focus on. So these are the three themes or narratives that really help us kind of navigate that space. And I'm thinking about the galleries themselves as a sea of islands. So we have clusters of works from different geographical locations, but actually what we draw out is that this is, even these four galleries that I look after are really an interconnected highway, and the single strand that connects all the art in the four galleries that you see are really, are really these three themes: voyaging, ancestry, and encounter, and that all the art in the galleries is really made by people that feel this kind of genealogical affinity. Rather than having a kind of heavy-duty geography lesson, I think that can help people to kind of start to penetrate some more profound cosmological and conceptual ideas that are inherent to the Pacific frame. So ancestry is invoked in all sorts of incredible sculpture. The earliest sculpture from the region that we have in the gallery is this Enyai Ewa sculpture from the Middle Sepik region of New Guinea. It's actually the earliest sculpture in the galleries between 16th and 17th century, and very unique because it was sheltered in a rock environment. So a lot of these early works, because of their ephemerality, haven't actually survived to this day. So this is really very rare, unique. It's a portrait of a founding ancestress, a clan, the ancestress of the clan group. And in terms of voyaging, I also want to pull out for people the fact that the idea of voyaging is not limited to the literal voyaging of physical and geographical movement across the open sea, but the notion of spiritual voyaging is, of course, also invoked in much of the sculptural art from the region. The creation of art was often a means to stage the necessary journey into another realm, from life to death, for example, with sculptures the focal point of ritual protocols that assisted in the transition across spiritual borders and thresholds. So once carved sculptures such as this Yipwan figure on the right from the Yiman people further east along the Sepik River in New Guinea was animated with words and chants, gesture and dance. It's been stripped of fibre and possibly bark cloth bindings. So that's another thing to think about when I'm working with the collections, is that these are kind of rather static, denuded sculptures now. They play more to the tastes of the European collectors and the tribal art market that they were kind of players in. And it's these same hook figures that so enthralled modernists in the European avant-garde in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This kind of radical rearrangement of abstracted bodily forms to create this unique geometry. So the gallery features large-scale iconic installations and monumental works, including this installation, the Cuomo ceiling. And I wanted to show this because it's the most contemporary, currently the most contemporary artwork in the gallery. It comprises over 270 individually painted panels, which are installed to evoke the pitched sides of the roof of a men's ceremonial house in Sepik region, again, of New Guinea. But what can we say about this? It was commissioned by Douglas Newton, then curator of the department, in 1971. So we haven't really kind of grown the collection since then, so it's kind of stuck in this, in this moment. And I'm working out ways that we can, move that forward. He commissioned and acquired over 270 panels of painted palm spathe from contemporary Cuomo artists. And descendants of these artists have been in touch with me to work out a project with other artists who've been visiting Mariwai village in the Washcook Hills. And we're going to try and kind of link up a house that they've built, that they've twinned with our house in the New York gallery, probably digitally. So we're going to have a space where we can actually try and kind of breach this gap in space and time. So this installation allows us to talk about the specifics of male initiation rites, but on a more conceptual level, it also introduces our visitors to the fundamentals of storytelling, to the passing on of knowledge and oral traditions across generations. And that each of the artworks really in the gallery are, in a certain sense, a means to story. They're a mnemonic device to revive the past and bring it right into the present, into the now. So in that sense, they're conduits or channels, and they have agency. The ancestral relationship that drives the connection between people and art in the Pacific is a foundational one, and it's gaining traction as a model with which to guide current engagements with Pacific art in museums and galleries, both in the Pacific and outside the region. More than simply artifacts, these artworks have agency and a vital role to play in initiating cultural dialogue beyond the Pacific. To develop this point, I just want to briefly reference a major exhibition that the Met hosted over 3 decades ago in September 1984, and look at some of the precedents that it set in the 1980s, which had a far-reaching and lasting impact on the cultural landscape of New Zealand, and that's had repercussions in other parts of the Pacific, and continues to have today, I would argue. And so just briefly to my title, Ngā Rā o Mua. Linguistically, this translates as walking backwards into the future, and it's often glossed as such. In a concept of time that we're familiar with, the past is usually conceived as being behind us and the future ahead. Life is a journey, and we picture ourselves walking along its path into the future. From a Maori or Polynesian perspective of time, it's not a path to be walked or a journey that you control. It is more akin to an elemental force, like wind or water, that moves towards and around you. So you stay still, and time moves. And the key to this concept in terms of ancestry in genealogy is that your past is known, it's been lived through and seen before, and therefore it's understood that the past lies in front, ki mua, but the future, still unknown, unseen, comes up from behind you, ki muri. So drawing on this genealogical certainty of one's forebears, it's the knowledge and experience of ancestors, i.e. those who have gone before, that anchors you in the present and guides you into the uncertain future. In 1984, the Metropolitan hosted a landmark exhibition of Maori art, which has come to be understood as a significant milestone in the cultural renaissance of Maori. A turning point, if you will, in the way in which museums and communities interacted around art from then on. Te Māori Maori art from New Zealand collections travelled to 4 major venues in the United States during the period 1984 to 86. And it was conceived by then Metropolitan Curator Douglas Newton and the Maori art historian Professor Hiranimoko Mead. Its first venue was New York, where it opened on the 10th of September 1984 to great acclaim. It continued to St. Louis Art Museum and the De Young Museum in San Francisco the following year. And then the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago negotiated an extension to present it there. And there it finished its US tour in 1986. Returning to New Zealand as Te Hokinga Mai, the return home, unprecedented levels of people attended the 4 venues in New Zealand where it was shown. These included ethnography museums in Otago and Wellington, as well as art galleries in Christchurch and Auckland. And approximately 900,000 people, that's 28% of the population, came out to see these artworks, tribal treasures, taonga. Songs were composed in their honour, and it was described at the time as the most remarkable cultural phenomenon that this country has ever experienced. So I'd like to just play some film footage from our archive which shows the beginning of the formal opening protocols which took place on the front steps of the museum on Fifth Avenue. Thanks. Mr. Sunny Waru of Taranaki began the ritual chants on the front steps. He's carrying a tokotoko, this walking stick. And the group's flanked by Jerry Rau Tangata and Dr. Peter Sharples of Ngāti Kahungunu. The New Zealand ambassador in Washington, D.C. and his wife were with the group, and both curators, as well as executive members of the Maori Management Committee who had handled many of the extensive negotiations with tribal groups in New Zealand. Once inside the museum, ritual chants were led by Sir James Henare for the Northern Iwi or tribes, Ruka Broughton of the Ngāti Pōneke region, and Monita Delamere for Matatua. Henare Tūwhangai performed the rituals in the exhibition area itself. In this way, tribes from each of the 4 corners of the island, Ngā Haue Whā, were represented. The group then took seats for the next stage of protocols, formal speeches or whaikorero, in which the group's skilled orators demonstrate their prowess in oratory and spoken word, an important art form in its own right. In total, an impressive 24 tribal groups, or iwi, were represented across all 4 venues for the duration of this major travelling exhibition. Maori staged dawn ceremonies and impromptu cultural performances, breaking into song and chanting to specific ancestral tribal figures in the galleries themselves. And this aspect eventually evolved into a more formal programme of outreach and education at each venue of the exhibition whilst it travelled across the states, and that was really unprecedented. And this is a shot from the final lineup, or hariru. where the two mutually distinct parties have come together, host and visitors, and share breath, or ho. And it signals the coming together of the two halves, and signals the end of these formal protocols. The impact of this exhibition was indeed far-reaching, and it's frequently cited as being responsible for establishing a new framework for cultural policy in New Zealand, in that not only did it change the overall perception of Maori culture, both abroad and at home, it forced a debate concerning issues surrounding the display and management of Maori collections of art and ethnography. In its process, the exhibition set new precedents in the areas of consultation and shared decision-making, and Maori tribal authorities were consulted from the outset. Curators were responsible for selecting works of art for display, but the New Zealand museums insisted on full Maori participation from the outset, and full consultation with Maori tribal authorities and elders was sustained throughout. The New Zealand museum staff acknowledged their very specific role as custodians of taonga, tribal treasures, on behalf of Maori, and were sensitive to the fact that despite their nominal legal ownership of Maori artifacts, let's say the physical, full spiritual and cultural custodianship, let's say the metaphysical, rested with a wide variety of Maori groups. And neither was this merely token support. Important decisions in key areas were taken out of the hands of museum professionals. Much debate surrounded this particularly significant sculpture, which both the American curators and Maori were keen to include in the exhibition. Nuku Tufatu. Nuku is an incredibly rare early carving found in 1906 at Lake Ngaroto near Te Awa Mutu. Nuku is the kaitiaki, or guardian deity, for the Waikato people from Tainui canoe. And only the upper section of this po, or post, remains, a full 167 centimetres in height. The guardianship of this carving was entrusted to one family. At certain times, Nuku was asked to manifest himself in the post so that he could be consulted by tohunga, ritual experts, who would consult the ancestral deity on behalf of the community. Conservators deemed the piece too fragile to sustain the pressures of such an extensive, four-venue travelling exhibition. Yet, contrary to their advice, and just a few days before the packing crates were due to be shipped to New York, a final decision was reached. The Maori queen, Dame Te Ata Irangi Kahu, insisted in the final hour that their ancestral carving, this iconic ancestral figure from the Waikato Tainui tribal authorities, would lead the exhibition of taonga into a foreign land, just as he had led their Maori tribe from Hawaii, the ancestral homelands in central Polynesia, to New Zealand. So Te Māori highlights in a very vivid way the distinctive manner in which taonga are conceived by Māori and Polynesians, that these are not deceased relics, but living spiritual objects that remain in relation to their living descendants. But what of today? What relevance does a show like Te Māori have for those of us working with art in museums and in large, let's say, encyclopedic museums? I was interested when I arrived at the museum to see kind of what the institutional memory of this show was, and it's kind of become eclipsed over the 3 decades. But for visitors that I host, Maori and Pacific Islanders and Polynesians, that's the first thing that they always say. They always talk about when they arrive, this was the venue for Te Māori. So it's very, high on the radar for people in the Pacific. In the intervening years since Te Māori in the 80s, the discipline in which I work, which straddles anthropology, ethnography, art history, archaeology, and museology, has, of course, been shifting. Collaborative research projects have been devised in which European and American researchers are now working alongside artists and practitioners from the Pacific, lessening the gap between knowledge and practice. Written documents are no longer perceived as the only valid primary sources. Artifacts, objects, the materiality of things in and of themselves, their agency, these ideas have begun to take center stage and open up pathways to different kinds of knowledge and understandings. And scholars in the Academy have begun to take more seriously these perspectives and viewpoints from such collaborators. For my own part, I've been trying to shift the perception of the gallery as simply a place where we present art from a particular region in a particular time of history. And I want us to kind of move towards an understanding of the galleries more as a place of encounter, a place to host in the manner that Pacific people are accustomed to do, a place to dialogue, a place to confront difficult histories, a place to explore indigenous epistemologies and have them open up a space and actually land and take root. And it's been useful to work with colleagues in departments like education and digital, who are kind of allies in this shared project to complicate the institutional narrative of the museum. And a number of projects have allowed me to do this, and I'll just touch on them briefly now. So last year I was lucky enough to have Visesio Siaso, a Tongan philosopher and contemporary artist, come to New York, where he was in Brooklyn for the International Curatorial and Studio Program. And he and I worked on a lot of projects together. This one we wanted to do in the galleries itself with an evening kind of event for our friends group. And he wanted to think about this ngatu uli is this large-scale Tongan, this bark cloth in black. He wanted to think about the cosmological significance of uli and the black and its relationship to red and white, these three really significant colours in Tonga and across the Pacific. And he asked to frame it in the, thinking about Anish Kapoor and his work with Vanta Black, who've created this, the blackest black ever, and he wanted to kind of pin it on contemporary artists, international artists who are working with black. And so we called it, can an artist own a colour? Because he wanted to really draw out the very distinctive conceptual framework of the colour for, and ideas about the va and the void for him as a Tongan. We had this wonderful young artist, Benjamin Work, come through the city, and he and I hosted an event in the Polynesian Gallery. One of the things I just wanted to point out is that some of these projects aren't really formalized. They're actually, people are just in touch with me when they're coming through New York, and I'm able to kind of pull them into the gallery, and we, I host them there, and we do something. And that's a very kind of quick and dynamic and agile way that we can actually kind of open up the collections to our visitors. And people always respond well when we're kind of able to do that in the gallery. Often, a big institution like the Met needs a lot of build-up time to program, and so that's not always the way we work in the Pacific. So sometimes I just have people coming in, and we need to kind of do something quite quickly. And education colleagues have been kind of really open and responsive to that. So one of the things that Benjamin wanted to do was look at the collections in the stores, and we looked at some of the early akoto, these Tongan clubs, late 18th century and early 19th century clubs, and one of them actually has a provenance that does relate to Cook and his touching into the Tongan archipelago in the late 18th century. And he took the iconography and designs from this club and he wanted to do a mural in the city, and I managed to find him a wall with our local school. And he actually did this fantastic mural in a couple of days, a kind of pop-up art project about 20 blocks up from the museum. And the thing that he liked about this project was that it was kind of democratizing the collection, that people didn't need to pay, that they could just come up and watch what was going on, and then he could really kind of raise the profile of the Pacific in the city. This is the first kind of Pacific kind of stamp on the city in terms of kind of the mural. It's part of the East Harlem mural series. Pulling people together in the collections is really a very valuable way of kind of drawing up histories and the memories of these individual works within the collection. So it's always useful, and this is a methodology that myself and other colleagues working in the field have begun to do, just to try and kind of pull in different people and from different disciplines, and to just really talk with the works in front of us to kind of really try and pull up some of the histories. And you often get taken to these very interesting places. I've worked with digital media to really kind of try and open up the parameters of the gallery itself. So working with the kind of robot beam, we've been able actually to beam in Pacific voices from outside of New York. So we can really, that kind of has a remarkable potential for drawing in the kinds of histories and perspectives on the art that we would like. We also kind of beamed across the American Museum of Natural History so that we could compare the kind of art installation that I look after at the Metropolitan with the kind of more science museological display across the park at the American Museum of Natural History. And that's a kind of important frame to kind of make explicit to our visitors, because that kind of museological display is often so implicit people don't kind of even notice. Rosanna Raymond was our fellow in education and public practice this last year. She's a performance artist, poet, and founder and president of the Savage Club, a collective that looks to kind of subvert ideas of Pacific peoples. And we did this really fun project where we wanted to subvert the this kind of classical idealized male nude in this kind of canon of the Greek and Roman galleries adjacent to the Pacific galleries. And this is her in her backhand maiden bark cloth dress. It's split at the back, so when she walked down what we called Naked Bottom Alley, you can see these marble statues of men principally, but there are the three graces also. She did this kind of very gentle curtsy, and the back of her dress opens to reveal her tattooed bottom. And so this was a really beautiful way to actually kind of imbue this kind of rather cold stone space with the warmth of natural fibers. She's wearing a bark cloth dress. And I'm working with this very talented dancer, performance artist, Jara Wasasala Rega, a Fijian and New Zealand-based artist who is looking to collaborate on an exhibition that I'm developing for next year. And it's important that I'm not only trying to bring in contemporary visual artists, but also have the oratory, the spoken word, the dance, the gesture, because this, as I mentioned earlier, is a really kind of key component of the art that's not being kind of presented. So just to conclude, to Maori, this exhibition of art that was presented over 30 years ago showed us what art can do in terms of raising the esteem and self-awareness of people, in terms of starting a dialogue that could see complex colonial histories begin to be slowly untangled in terms of changing policy. And I think perhaps the power in the art is in joining up history with its people. Bringing people into the galleries in the projects we've done over the last year helps connect the living dynamic with the collections to activate and enliven the relationships I've been talking about. Opening up the collection to artists and researchers is more in keeping with our view that the collections are not simply a static resource from which to borrow for exhibitions or gallery installations, but more as a dynamic means to highlight key relationships. In this sense, we're building on the original notion of the role of a curator, to take care of, to attend to, kurare, towards that of kaitiakitanga, or guardianship, custodianship, in which we're looking to re-establish relationships, to reinforce the alliances and networks that have become eclipsed over time and help safeguard this knowledge. And this is really the duty and obligation of us as a cultural institution to kind of move us in this kind of globalized world to puncture this very kind of almost rigid presentation of the art. This work is cross-cultural and interdisciplinary. It can bridge the past with the present. These projects push at the boundaries of the institution, forcing it to reassess itself, to become more self-reflexive. Stepping back then to ask ourselves about art's ability to disrupt the status quo. When someone walks into a museum, we do have an opportunity to help them step back and consider, to think and perhaps even reconfigure. Can we jolt them out of their own reality into someone else's? Can we break down the overarching institutional voice and present multiple layers, inclusive histories, rejigged narratives? Can we interfere with their accepted regimes of value and understanding? Can artists help us do this? Yes. Thanks very much.